Being a great wrestler isn't something that happens overnight. No, like any skill, you have to work for it for years before you can reach your full potential. And that's why it's so satisfying to watch the journeys of our favorite wrestlers over the years as they climb the ladder and become the talent they were always destined to be. But what are the biggest examples of this in action? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today, so join us as we take a deep dive into leveled up wrestlers who made huge improvements. And if we're going to start anywhere, let's do so with one of the more modern examples of this, and that's the changes which Dean Ambrose has undergone since becoming Jon Moxley once again. Yes, it's strange to think that it was only 4 years ago that Mox was in the WWE. And sure, he was just as good then as he is now, but rather than portray him as the sadistic, hardcore performer he is now, he was given the role of playing wacky Uncle Dean. And this meant that he'd be forced to do things like drive a hot dog cart down to the ring, dress like a Mountie, or have a conversation with his new friend Mitch the Potted Plant. Stuff which might have worked great for the younger kids watching, but which were a far cry from what the rest of the audience was looking for. Hell, even when he turned heel in 2018, rather than be written as a killer bad guy, he'd spend most of his time telling the audience they smelled or getting inoculations in his rear end. Thankfully though, the following year Ambrose would jump ship to AEW and go back to a character much more suited to his skill set. Yes, now with the shackles off, Jon Moxley instantly felt like a new man, one who was so great both in the ring and on the mic that by early 2020, he'd be AEW World Champion. And he wouldn't stop there either, because doing whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, he'd bring his unscripted violence all over the world, whether it be by taking on Nick Gage in a GCW deathmatch, or by having a Duel of the Fates-style steel chair battle with Minoru Suzuki over in New Japan Pro Wrestling. Of course, his home base has remained AEW, however, because it's there that, as a founding member of the Blackpool Combat Club, he's had so many great moments, it's easy to lose count. Seriously, it doesn't matter if it's Hangman Page, MJF, Bryan Danielson, Kenny Omega, or even CM Punk, everyone has stepped in the ring with him at some point, and they've each paid the price. And with him now being a record 3-time AEW World Champion, there's a solid argument which could be made for Mox being the GOAT of that particular promotion. That said, he's not the only former member of the Shield who currently has a claim to this title, because back over in WWE, Roman Reigns has gone through quite a journey over the past decade. Yes, any modern-day wrestling fan will no doubt be very familiar with the difficulties the big dog faced during his early days on the main roster as, after a legendary run with the Hounds of Justice, he was rocketed up the card way before he was ready, with this leading to fans turning on him en masse. It wasn't that he was bad, of course. It was just that everyone could see he needed more time. And on top of this, it felt very much like yet another example of Vince McMahon telling fans who their new hero was. Still, even if he got nuclear heat everywhere he went, it didn't matter as far as his boss was concerned, because between 2015 and 2018, Roman would main event WrestleMania 4 times. But for as much as he was pushed, the reality remained that he just wasn't over as a top guy. That was until the summer of the latter year, of course, because after taking a sabbatical from the ring, the big dog returned and did what everyone had wanted him to do for years: he turned heel. Following this then, it was like a new man had entered the picture, as now portraying the tribal chief, Reigns suddenly became cool. More than that, he became a convincing final boss for WWE as he beat absolutely everyone and everything in his path. Sure, it helped that he had his bloodline around him in the form of Paul Heyman, the Usos, and later Solo Sikoa, but it wasn't like he needed them to win. Now that was just extra garnish on top of the steak. In fact, by the time the latter Anoa'i family member came around, the tribal chief had already unified the WWE and Universal titles and was the longest reigning world champion the company had seen since Hulk Hogan. Then when Sami Zayn entered the picture in 2022, it turned the bloodline from the hottest stable in WWE to one of the greatest angles in wrestling history. So it's easy to see why this transformation should have happened earlier then, as had it done so, we might have been spared years of bad shows. But sometimes this is easy to say in hindsight. After all, who could have ever foreseen how much better Dominic Mysterio would get once he turned heel? Yes, this one is particularly surprising, as during the early days of his main roster run between 2019 and 2022, the son of Rey Mysterio showed very little in the way of personality. And this meant that many fans thought that, despite his pedigree, WWE's attempts to build him up as their next big young breakout star were going to fail. But anyone who thought such a thing would be proven wrong as it turned out, because after going heel and joining up with the Judgment Day in the summer of the latter year, Dominic suddenly became entertaining. Yeah, it's undeniable that now playing the role of trophy boyfriend to his sugar mommy Rhea Ripley, the youngest Mysterio is easily one of the highlights of Raw every week. Maybe it's the mere association with the Nightmare which makes him feel good, or maybe it's the fact that he now seems to be in on the joke. After all, how couldn't he be when, following his night-long spell in prison, he since started acting like he's Tony Montana returning from doing hard time? Whatever the reason, it's been quite a transformation for Dominic, and as a result, it now feels like he could be a real top star one day. But then maybe it shouldn't come as a surprise that someone which wasn't taken seriously was able to transform themselves, because almost 2 decades prior, The Miz was going through a similar situation himself. That's right, when he first debuted with WWE in 2006, few thought Mike Mizanin was going to make it. As far as they were concerned, he was nothing but a former reality TV star looking to cash in on his 15 minutes in exchange for a wrestling contract. And this perception wasn't helped by the fact that during his early days on the roster, he was little more than a host, usually introducing segments on SmackDown and rarely showing fans any evidence he was going to be there as a wrestler. As time went on, however, he would start hitting the ring more and more, with him eventually beginning to win some titles. That said, fans, for the most part, still refused to get behind him as, with his skills being below what they expected of a top guy, he just couldn't win them over no matter how hard he tried. But as they say, persistence is the key. And so it was by the time the mid-2010s came around. Not only was The Miz a former WWE World Champion and WrestleMania main eventer, but he was also getting a lot of appreciation for his great heel work. Yes, it might have taken him a while to get there, but by then it was undeniable just how much improvement he'd shown both in the ring and on the mic. And that was particularly evident in some of his hidden gem classic matches against the likes of Dolph Ziggler, Cesaro, and Seth Rollins. Hell, even when he won the WWE title for a second time in early 2021, while it wasn't a move welcomed by most fans, there was at least an understanding that Mizanin was now at a level where such a position didn't feel out of place anymore. And given the fact he seems to be showing no signs of stopping anytime soon, there's every possibility a third world title run could be on the cards somewhere down the line. That said, if he does do this, he'll no doubt have to go through another performer who's transformed himself greatly over the last few years too. Who are we talking about here? Why, Drew McIntyre, of course. Now, it's easy to look at the Scottish Warrior today and see a man who's very clearly destined to be a main event star, but that wasn't always the case for him. No, back during his first run with WWE in the late 2000s and early 2010s, Drew struggled to get beyond mid-card level. And this was despite the fact that Vince McMahon himself personally endorsed the rookie on TV, a move which at the time felt like it ensured he'd be WWE champion before long. Unfortunately for the Scotsman though, that never happened, and instead, he'd end up as part of a comedy undercard act, 3MB, usually being used as jobber material for other names higher up on the pecking order. So realizing a change had to be made, Drew took his release in 2014 as an opportunity to rebuild himself. And rebuild himself he most certainly did, because by the time he returned to New York 3 years later, he was noticeably bulkier and had an aura to him which just hadn't been there before. Needless to say then, his brief time on NXT which followed would see him win their world title from Bobby Roode. And when he was moved up to the main roster after that, he'd spend the next couple of years working his way up the ranks to the point that in 2020, he'd win the Royal Rumble and book his spot in the main event of WrestleMania 36. And yes, this was the WrestleMania held in front of an empty warehouse, so the moment wasn't as grand as it should have been when it happened. But that didn't stop Drew from defeating Brock Lesnar here to finally become WWE champion and prove that he really was that good all along. He just needed an opportunity to show it. Of course, since losing the belt to Bobby Lashley in early 2021, the Scottish Warrior has struggled to regain the top spot again. But that doesn't mean he won't get back there eventually. After all, as his performance against Roman Reigns at September 3rd, 2022's Clash at the Castle proved, he could take the title back tomorrow if he was given a fair fight. And he's not the only person who's currently looking to regain the top prize after finding themselves rising all the way to the pinnacle in recent years, because over in the WWE's women's division, Liv Morgan is in exactly the same situation. But how did Liv get to this point? After all, during the second half of the 2010s, few had her pegged for such greatness, as she felt very much like the third best member of the Riot Squad. Over time though, she proved that there was more to her than just being a sidekick. No, if given the chance, she could actually be a formidable threat on her own. And just as well she did this, because once the Riot Squad split in 2019 and both Ruby Riott and Sarah Logan both eventually found themselves out of a job, it was left to Liv to carry on the legacy of the stable herself as she went solo. Of course, this wouldn't be a time without challenges though, as during the early 2020s, the New Jersey native was forced to plot her way through a dead-on-arrival storyline with Rusev, Lana, and Bobby Lashley. Once that was over though, things started to pick up as, after winning the 2022 Women's Money in the Bank ladder match, Morgan suddenly had an opportunity to challenge for a world title at a time of her choosing. That said, on the SmackDown brand she called home at this point, the champion was none other than Ronda Rousey, a fearsome competitor by anyone's standard. So with no one expecting her to beat the former UFC bantamweight champion then, it was assumed this one would be a bust. And that's what made it all the more shocking when, later the same night, Liv cashed in and beat Ronda, becoming the new SmackDown Women's Champion in the process. After that, she beat Ronda again in the rematch at SummerSlam, with this making her the only person in WWE to pin the Olympian twice. And sure, she would lose the belt soon thereafter, but with such a feather now in her cap, it means she's been elevated to the point that she'll always be a viable contender again in the future. Yes, Liv Morgan has gone through one of the best transformations in the industry over the past few years, similar to the rise of one of the top rookies in the industry today. Of course, to look at her story in more detail though, we have to journey back over to AEW, because it's there that Jade Cargill has been making the TBS title her own. Yes, perhaps no one else in AEW right now has developed such an aura of star power as quickly as the Florida native has. You only have to take one look at her, in fact, to realize she's the future of the AEW women's division, and that it's only a matter of time until she wins their world title too. For the meantime though, Jade has been content to rise up the ranks at her own pace, beating absolutely everyone in her path. That's right, whether it be Ty Mello, Athena, Thunder Rosa, or countless others, no one has been able to stop her warpath. So perhaps it should come as no surprise that when the TBS title was introduced in early 2022, Jade went on to win it after beating Ruby Soho in the finals of the tournament. And since then, she's continued to hold it for 427 days and counting as of the time of this video's recording, with it looking unlikely she's going to drop it anytime soon. After all, as she said, the TBS belt represents what she wants to turn AEW into, and that's that bitch show. Something which is hard to argue with when you realize her overall career win-loss record is currently sitting at 53-0. So the only question remaining is, what does she do next? Does she decide to take the AEW Women's World title from Jamie Hayter? Or does she break open the forbidden door and go after Mercedes Moné's IWGP Women's belt? The choice is hers, and the only thing we can say for sure is that, whatever she decides upon, her next opponent will have to work hard to finally be the one to defeat her. But even for as great as Jade Cargill is becoming, there's still a lot of people who label another women's star as being the all-time best. And that's because before folks like Becky Lynch or Sasha Banks were taking women's wrestling in North America to new heights, it was left to Trish Stratus to carry the flag during the Attitude Era. But how did she do this? Well, by defying all expectations and turning into one of the best women wrestlers of her generation, something no one expected when she first joined the industry as a former fitness model in early 2000. But then why would they expect anything more of her at the time? After all, women's wrestling during the turn of the millennium WWF was largely treated like a sideshow designed to titillate the young males watching. That said, the landscape began to change as time went on account of the work of the likes of Trish Stratus and Lita, as well as others like Ivory and Molly Holly. Yes, the Canadian had little desire to be treated as just eye candy, and so that was why, over the course of the next couple of years, she continued to train hard, with her eventually getting to a point where she'd become WWF Women's Champion in November of 2001. And don't make any mistake, this was no token run she'd gotten on account of her looks. No, she'd earned every moment of it, as by then, she was fast becoming one of the best women's wrestlers in North America. So good would she get, in fact, that over the next couple of years, she'd not only main event Raw with Lita, but she'd also put on what was at the time probably the best women's match in WWE history when she defended her title against Mickie James at WrestleMania 22. Once this was over though, feeling like she'd achieved everything she could, Trish hung up her boots and retired from full-time in-ring competition. And while she would make the occasional return over the near 2 decades which followed, whenever she did, it was a different company she was coming back to, one that was by then dominated by a whole new crop of stars. Of course, not all of these stars reached their full potential within the WWE system though, no matter how over they got with fans. And if you want a perfect example of that, you only have to look at how Matt Cardona had to shed the skin of Zack Ryder in order to become the hottest thing on the indies. But it didn't have to be this way. No, if Vince McMahon had gotten behind Ryder like fans were begging him to do in 2011, he could have been a legit main event figure on both Raw and SmackDown. In the end though, his decision to get over without management's express written consent saw him largely be buried over the next 9 years. So much so that at a certain point, fans forgot what it was they loved about him in the first place. Luckily then, when he was released from his contract in 2020, and from there returned to the indies under his real name, Cardona was able to remind everyone just what made him special. And this was because, now working for the NWA, Impact, and even a short stint in AEW, he continued to take advantage of every opportunity he was given. Yes, Matt Cardona was now expanding his horizons by doing things such as working a deathmatch with Nick Gage in Game Changer Wrestling. And so over did this get him as a heel that by July of 2021, he'd have beaten Cage to become the GCW World Champion, with this marking the first time in his career he'd ever held the top prize in any promotion. But that wasn't the end of things, because a year after this, he'd become NWA World's Champion too, something which will now forever put him amongst the pantheon of legendary figures such as Lou Thesz, Harley Race, and Ric Flair. And just to think, had he not been fired from WWE and been forced to reinvent himself, none of this may have ever happened. But then the same could be said for our next subject, as despite failing to make a splash as Derek Bateman in early 2010's WWE, once he went over to Impact, EC3 showed the world exactly what he was capable of. What was that? Well, it was being someone who could comfortably fill the role of a main event heel in what was at the time arguably still the number 2 promotion in North America. And sure, 2015 TNA was hardly late 90s WCW or modern day AEW, but it was still a place with a lot of talented wrestlers. So if you wanted to reach the top, you had to stand out. Luckily then, EC3 did just this, as using his cocky attitude and impressive in-ring skills, he'd soon find himself becoming TNA World Heavyweight Champion on 2 separate occasions. That said, when he returned to WWE in 2018, now with all the momentum in the world, things didn't go quite as planned, and so soon he'd be back in a lower card role. And, well, for most men, this second failure would have been enough to cause them to quit altogether. It wasn't the case for Ethan Carter III. No, once he was released for a second time by Vince McMahon in 2020, he joined forces with Braun Strowman to create his own promotion, Control Your Narrative. And while the status of CYN is currently in limbo, he's since committed to find work in the likes of the NWA, where he hopes to rebuild himself back up to a main event position all over again.